I saw something strange yesterday. There was a little football game that happened yesterday. And you know what happened outside that game? There was tailgating, and there was a 242 tailgating booth where you had Spartans and Wolverines. People from our Ann Arbor campus, people from our Lansing campus came together and gave out 242 footballs and 242 popcorn and 242 invitations to come to our Lansing campus. Now, where else do you see Wolverines and Spartans get together except because of Jesus? You know what I'm saying? That is awesome. So a couple strange things yesterday, but it was awesome. Stranger Things comes from the Netflix series. How many of you have seen this, either advertised or you watched it? Was it not? I love that little show. There was something about it. For those of you that didn't see it, it's on Netflix, and it was just this show about these little preteens in the 80s. Okay, started out playing little Dungeons & Dragons and riding their little bikes all over the neighborhood. It was a little nostalgic for me, I got to be honest, like looking at that. And what happens is this monster from the upside down world, this strange world, comes in and takes one of the kids, and then they have to work together with the sheriff and the mom and everybody to get the kids back. And just a great little story. Now, those of you that saw it, do you know they're coming out with another one next year, which is really cool, like a second episode of it. Now, we were sitting around the office talking about Stranger Things, the show, and all of our teaching pastors, and we started thinking about, that was a strange world, but we're living in a strange world. We're living in a world where, the racial tension you'd think should just be getting better and better and better and better, and yet it seems like it's really been a real problem. It's been in the news a lot more recently. People become more aware of what's going on. We've seen Christians being persecuted overseas more more last year in 2015 than ever before. Did you know that? There have been more Christian martyrs in 2015 than in the past 200 years. That's strange, guys. This world not getting better, not getting better. The election. Need I say more? I mean, you talk about something strange. I mean, it's like watching a soap opera. The problem is it's real. It is real, and it's just so strange. We're sitting around going, man, we're living in a strange world. So we thought we'd do this Stranger Things series. And next week, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about our strange world that we're living in and how Christians should interact with it. And in particular next week, that's going to be the Sunday, the weekend, right before the election. Folks, we are going to, here's the teaser, okay? This is, I hope, what will get you here and get you to bring a friend. 242 is going to tell you how to vote. Ooh, that's going to be crazy. I don't know what to think of that. Well, that's good. That's a teaser. Hopefully get you back. 242 is going to tell you how to vote, okay? So come back for that. Now, this week, though, what I want to do is I want to tell you about probably one of the strangest men that has ever lived. One of the strangest men in history, all right? I'm going to tell you about a guy by the name of Jesus. Now, you say, well, that sounds a little sacrilegious, Dave. I got to be honest, that you call Jesus strange. That sounds a little bit disrespectful, but hold on. Because I looked up the definition for strange, and the definition says it's unusual or surprising in a way that is hard to understand. Unusual or surprising in a way that is hard to understand. Folks, I got two words for you: virgin birth. Is that not unusual? Is that not hard to understand? How does that work? And yet, that's Jesus. Think of the teaching of Jesus. Those of you who are new, let me tell you, some of the things Jesus said, they were just hard to understand. And they would surprise people in that culture back then, and I think in our culture today. Jesus would say things like, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Oh, okay. What does that mean? Jesus would say, the greatest among you is the greatest servant among you. And in that upwardly mobile, trying to dominate from the top down culture, that just sounded strange to people and hard to understand. Do you remember when Jesus raised the bar on sexual sin? Remember when he said, you have heard it said that you should not commit adultery with a woman. But I tell you, if you look upon a woman with lust, it's as if you've committed adultery with her in your mind already. And Jesus raises the bar. Now, can you imagine what that would have sounded like in that culture? I'll tell you what, imagine what that would have sounded like if Jesus was street preaching in Las Vegas today. right? Jesus said things that were hard to understand. They were surprising. They were, by definition, they were strange. Now, if none of those things sound strange to you, listen to this one in John 6:53. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Oh, what? I mean, I'm sitting there in the crowd, I'm listening to Jesus teach. He says, you know what, love your neighbor. And I'm like, oh, that is good. That is good stuff. Jesus said, you know what, you ought to honor your father and mother. Wow, that's wise. I love my mom. Love that. That's great, Jesus. Jesus said, and in conclusion, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. What? Honey, get the kids, we're out of here. This guy's a nut, you know. And yet these are the things that Jesus said. Now, by the way, Roman historians believed, you can go back and look at this, Roman historians believed that the early Christians were cannibals because they talked about eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood. In other words, it was strange. It was hard for them to understand what was going on. Now, if you grew up in church, or if you've been coming here for a while, you probably know that what Jesus was talking about, what he was referring to, was communion. This symbolic meal representing his body and his blood, the juice, the bread. And we get that, right? But back then it was strange. Maybe strange if you're new here today. Maybe that's a little strange to you. But see, here's the thing. Jesus always seemed to have a reason for the strange things that he did or said. He always had something he was trying to teach. One night, they were at a dinner party, all the disciples and Jesus, and nobody washed anybody's feet. Now, that was common back then. Everybody's feet were supposed to be washed. They were out in sandals in a dusty place. They didn't, they had a lot of animals and things. And so when they sat down for dinner, when they reclined at dinner and people's feet were kind of like at nose level, they would wash feet. But it was a slave's job. And yet, since no one else did it, Jesus, who's supposed to be the rabbi, Jesus picks up a basin of water and a towel, and he washes his disciples' feet. And they're going, oh, this is so strange. This is hard to understand. But Jesus was trying to teach them something about servant leadership. Jesus went out of his way one time. I mean, the straightest distance between 2 points is here to there. It's a straight line. But Jesus went out of his way when traveling one time to get to Samaria, because in Samaria at noon that day, there was a Jacob's well where everybody was going to get water, and there was a lady there, and Jesus wanted to teach something. He did something very strange. He walked up to a lady and engaged her in conversation. Now, back then, that just didn't happen. But Jesus wanted to give dignity to a woman. He wanted to teach people that. And not only that, this woman was a Samaritan woman, and the Jews hated Samaritans, and Samaritans hated Jews. So not only is she a woman, but she is an ethnically diverse woman, and Jesus decides, I need to give dignity to this woman. He's trying to teach us something. It was strange in that culture what he did, engaging her in conversation. Not only was she an ethnically diverse woman, she was an ethnically diverse woman who was repeatedly in sexual sin. This was a huge no-no for these conservative Jewish rabbis. And yet Jesus reaches out and engages this woman and gives dignity to this woman in all of his actions and all these things that in those cultures and maybe in our culture today we would be like, wow, that is surprising. That is hard to understand. That is strange. Jesus, he had something he was trying to teach. And so I want to tell you a story today. I just want to tell you a story from Jesus' life. It's in John 9. If you got your Bible apps, you can go to John 9 and follow along. We'll put some verses up on the screen as well. But as I tell you this story, we're going to stop along the way and just try and learn a few things, because some of these things are just kind of strange and hard to understand. Well, let's get into it. He says, as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, the only career choice you have as a blind man in this culture is begging. So here's Jesus with a crowd of people. By the way, he was popular. People would follow him around. And so there was a crowd of people. There were the uncommitted crowd. There were the followers, his disciples. There were the Pharisees who would jump in from time to time. And then they come upon this man who's begging, and Jesus stops. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents that he was born blind. Now stop right there. Because that right there is a mistake that we so often make. Man, doesn't God get the bad rap so often for the things that go wrong in life? We kind of want to shake our fist instinctually at God. I used to work at State Farm Auto Claims. And before we would write down a claim and send off the check, we'd have to write down the reason for what happened, a description of what happened. And what would happen is if a tree limb fell on your car, do you know what we had to call that? That was called an act of God. And like God's getting blamed for all this stuff. And folks, so here's the thing. Like that is weather and the fact that somebody didn't trim their tree enough. That's probably what that is. Okay, but no, we're going to blame God on that. Listen, it does happen in Scripture. You see a few times where God actively causes tough situations in people's lives. That does happen. But what happens more often in our lives is that we make a poor decision and then we have a poor outcome because of that decision. Are you with me? We get on a scale. You ever get on a scale and it doesn't say what you want? And you want to go, God, and my parents, why did you give me this metabolism? You know. But you got to look back over last week and see the cheeseburger you ate here and the donut you ate here and that sort of thing, because a lot of times it's the choice you make that causes the outcome that happens. How many of you know that sometimes it's not the choice you make, but it's a choice someone else makes? Some drunk driver decides he's going to, drink and get behind the wheel of a car, and he jumps the curb, ends up hitting your car. It wasn't your fault. It's not a choice you made, but it was a dumb choice that someone else made. But then sometimes we'll go ahead and shake our fist at God for the dumb choice that someone else made. And God's going, hello. Like, I'm trying to help. That's why I'm here. I'm here to reach out to help. Like, that's my role in this thing. I'm not causing all this bad stuff. You say, God, why didn't you create a world where there weren't weather that came in and made a tree limb fall on a car? God said, well, I did. I created a perfect world. There were no tornadoes. There was no cancer when I created the world, but then y'all came around and broke it. And now it's broken and we live in a broken world. And there are times when God removes his hand of protection or God removes his hand of blessing, and then there are times where the fallen world falls because it's broken. But it's not that God caused it, it's just that he kind of steps back every once in a while. It's kind of like when I play basketball with my boys out on the driveway. I've got two boys, and guess what? They're competitive. They want to win. And they're aggressive with each other, and they get at it with each other. But when I'm there, this is what I try to do is I try to encourage them. I try to talk the whole time. Buddy, that was a great shot. Good try. Way to go. Like, I'm trying to be as positive as possible, try to keep everybody simmered down. And then there'll be times, though, when they start trash talking each other, and I have to shut it down. No, don't say that. Come on, apologize to him right now before the emotions get crazy. Or there's somebody who'll have a foul, and sometimes I have to referee, and I go, no, that was a foul. Let's go back, shoot some shots or whatever. When I'm there, I keep peace on the court. But do you know what happens when I go inside for dinner? It takes about 3 minutes before those sinners are at each other, okay? I mean, it's just a natural thing. It's something in their blood. Like, they just come at each other. When I leave, the peace leaves. And that's what happens with God sometimes. There are areas or times or moments where by our actions, maybe, we would sometimes say, God, I'm not looking for your help in this area of my life. God, I'm not going to obey your principles for this area of my life. And sometimes God says, well, okay, I'm going to back off. And then the fallen world falls. Or sometimes the fallen world just falls out just because it's a fallen world, and God is hoping that at some point it'll drive us to reach out to ask him for help. You think about marriage. You think about what marriage is, okay? Two broken, wounded, sinful, selfish people, and we expect them to share the covers for a lifetime. Man, I'm telling you what, I need God in that relationship. I need to follow his principles for that relationship. I need to serve. I need to love unconditionally. I need to forgive. I need his kingdom. Like when we pray that prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. That's God. That's me saying, God, I want you to reign in, like, on earth as it is in heaven. In my marriage, I want you to be in control. I want you to push back the chaos of this fallen world and have a little dominion in my little house with my family. You think about finances. You think about, now listen to what we do with finances, okay? We live in a world of greed, scarcity, uncertainty, rising healthcare and college tuition costs. And we have the audacity to think, you know what? Our goal is we're going to amass enough wealth that one day we can stop working and just live off our wealth, and we call it retirement. And that's awesome. But for a lot of people, that is a recipe for disappointment. And so guess what I try to do? Man, God, this is crazy what I have this goal to do. So I'm going to ask you, God, when it comes to the way I spend my money, the way I go into debt, the way I'm generous, what I do, God, I just want to follow you in my finances. I want you to reign in my finances. I want your blessing in that area of my life. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say to you, not that I have to be God's PR person, like he's big enough to do it on his own, but for your sake, I'm not trying to protect his reputation. What I'm trying to say is if we see God as up there with these lightning bolts just waiting for us to step out of bounds, rather than a God who's saying, I'm here to help when you need me, then what will happen is, if our attitude is that, then what will happen is something bad will happen, and we will let that be a wedge between God and us, rather than allow it to be the thing that pushes us to God. Does that make sense? So it really matters who you're blaming for stuff and how you think the world works and your worldview of the universe. Because what is supposed to, or some people are allowing to be a wedge between you and God is really supposed to be the thing that is driving you to your knees and saying, God, please help us. We want that. Now we're going to see that in this story. A bad thing happens, and Jesus is going to tell us why it happened. In this next verse, he says in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned. You got that all wrong. But this happened so that the works of God, notice he didn't say God caused it. He said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. God's going to do something because of it. Then he goes on, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Then he gets to work. Verse 6, he says, after saying this, he spit on the ground. He made some mud with the saliva, and he put it on the man's eyes. And we are back to the strangeness, folks. This is strange. Jesus spits on the ground. Now, do you ever think about making mud with spit? Maybe you don't think about this. Maybe I'm the only person that thinks about this. But how much spit does it take? Do you ever read the Bible and just be like, does Jesus have miraculous spit where he just does one and somehow it multiplies like the fishes? I don't know. I'm imagining Jesus is like a lot of spit to make mud. And the whole time, this guy who's been born blind, his whole life he's been blind. And there's a crowd around him, and maybe he's not quite sure what's going on. Next thing you know, somebody's spitting. I imagine he's going, because the whole time people have been making fun of him. They've been putting kick me scrolls on his back. They've been making fun of him his whole life. And so people are spitting. He's not sure what's going on. And Jesus is spitting and spitting and spitting. Next thing you know, he's got mud, and he starts wiping it on this guy's eyes. That is strange. Now, I will say it might not be as strange to them. Jesus did heal people with spit involved 2 other times, if you go look that up. And it was believed back then that our saliva had some sort of healing properties, maybe because they realized that dogs actually have healing properties in their saliva. They have antipeptides, and so if a dog licks your wound, it actually helps you heal. That's why they lick their own wounds. In fact, there were healing centers back in that day where people could actually pay to go allow a dog that was trained to lick their wounds. I'm telling you the truth. This is the history. And so maybe when Jesus is spitting, people are going, okay, well, that makes a little sense. That's kind of a part of our culture. But then he spits in the mud. We don't know of anybody really doing that, or we don't even know exactly why Jesus did it. It could be that he was taking some dust of the ground. Because if you read in Genesis, God created us from the dust of the ground. And maybe Jesus is trying to say something like, you know what? I will recreate what God created in the same way that he created it. I will recreate it. It could be, though, just plain Jesus was trying to get him dirty. You say, what do you mean? Jesus is trying to get him all dirty because then he's setting up a washing, a cleansing. Because look what he does, a purification. Look what he says in, where are we? In verse 7. Go, he told him, wash in the Pool of Siloam. Now, the Pool of Siloam is about 50 feet wide. It's about 20 feet wide, 50 feet long. It's in the middle of Jerusalem. King Hezekiah built it in Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. It was a tactic to protect the city from attacking armies, because an army would besiege the city and try to cut off water supply and food supply to the city, and they would starve them out, basically, to take over a city. And so they basically, from the Gihon Spring, drilled through 2,000 feet of solid rock, and this spring then fed inside the city, and they had a water supply. It's brilliant, really. It's just amazing. And this thing would fill up twice a day, and so if somebody besieged the city, this was the only source of life. This was the only source of hope that they had, was this well, this basin, this pool. In fact, so much so that over hundreds of years, they started calling it not just the Pool of Siloam, but they would call it the Messiah's Pool, the Pool of Salvation, the pool that it's our only hope. And so maybe just this strange thing that Jesus did with spittle and mud was just about helping this guy understand that his healing is coming from the Messiah, from salvation. I mean, this cleansing, this purification that needs to happen for healing and life change. Yeah, Jesus just had always reasons for the strange things that he did. Well, it goes on. It says, so the man went and he washed and he came home seeing. And Jesus wanted to use this situation in this man's life to teach him something. But he also wanted to use this man's life to teach others. A lot of times that's what will happen when something bad happens in our life. And we get so focused on, like, us. But a lot of times God may even just want to use what's going on in our life to teach others. And that's what happens here. It's interesting. In verse 8, it says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? And some claimed that he was. Others said, no, it just looks like him. But the guy said, no, I am the man. Verse 10, how then were your eyes open? They asked him. He said, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. Oh, I don't know. Now, that's strange to me. It's strange to me that, a guy could be healed by Jesus and then just kind of go back to his normal life and not even, seek Jesus out. Wouldn't the first thing, as soon as my eyes opened and I could see, I'd want to go find him to say thank you, wouldn't you? And yet this guy has allowed this healing to be more exciting than the healer in his life. He's just talking about the healing with his friends and family, and he's kind of totally, I don't know if he's totally forgotten Jesus, but at least Jesus is on the back burner. And Jesus is the healer. And I tell you what, guys, I gotta be honest, that happens in my life. I think it probably happens in all of our lives, where we let the gift of God replace the giver in our affection, the things that we get really excited about. Some of us come to church because we just want better relationships and more money, and we want to get along better in life rather than seeking God. Now, we say we're seeking God, but what we're really seeking is the blessings of God. We just did a series on this whole thing called idols. This idea that, some things get more important in our priority list than they should, and sometimes even to the point that they become like gods to us, because we're sacrificing to them. We get more excited about them than God. And it hurts God. I know that. I mean, when I came home, Grace was 3 years old. Barely talk at 3 years old, so you could just get a cute little voice. And I came home, and when I came home, she would get excited. She got really excited, put her arms around my neck. I love you, Daddy. And I gave her this little Jolly Rancher that was in my pocket. And she was like, candy. She was so excited. And then the next day, when I came home, She ran right up to me, did the same thing, put her arms around me, and she said, I love you, Daddy, Candy. Like something was changing. I didn't know quite what it was until the next day when I came home. She just ran up to me and said, Candy. You know, like this little dude. They're all sinners. All my kids are sinners. You need to know that. And do you understand, like in my heart, her affection, like the gift had replaced the giver as the thing that she was really excited about. And maybe that's what's going on here. And I don't know if that happens in your life, but I'm telling you, man, when you have a relationship with your heavenly Father, like he's the thing to get excited about. And then guess what? He loves to give you good gifts. He really does. But don't let the gift ever replace the giver. All right, let's keep going. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Oh, say it isn't so. Because Jesus did a little work on the Sabbath. You see, God had said back in the Big Ten, in the Ten Commandments, you're supposed to take a day and keep it holy. Cease from your work and keep it holy and dedicate it to the Lord. And then the Pharisees came along after that and said, well, yeah, okay, but let's really define this. Let's not even worry about the spirit of the law. Let's get to the letter of the law, and let's add a bunch of letters. Let's add a bunch of laws so that we make it impossible for anybody to... And that's what they did. They got to the point where if Jesus just went, that's work. He broke the Sabbath. And the Pharisees are going to want to zero in on this thing. And they're all upset about it. Can I just say, like, why weren't the Pharisees excited about this guy that got healed? This changed life? Is their heart in the right place at all? Are they keeping the main thing, when somebody could come and a miracle happens in this poor man's life? Where he had been a beggar his whole life. People look down on him thinking that God's judging him because there's sin in his life because he's born blind. And this guy's life has just been changed. And this is a time for celebration. This is a time to worship God. Amazing stuff. And the Pharisees, all they can think about is, I think you broke one of our little religious rules. These guys are not keeping the main thing. And I just want to say, can we please always keep it the main thing in this church? This is a point where you got to help me a little bit because I might start preaching. I might. And if you could just kind of, the more you go, yeah, and I see your head nodding, I will know I do not have to raise my volume, okay? Because here's the deal. Like when I used to do a college ministry at a church, and they tell me, go out and reach these college students. So we went out and reached college students. Well, guess what? Next thing you know, they're finding cigarette butts outside the church building. Because we're reaching people, they didn't grow up in church. They don't, whatever, they're out there smoking. And I had the leadership of that church come and ask me, hey, what kind of people are we trying to reach and bring into this church? I mean, that kind of stuff just irks me. It just bugs me. When we came into this building, you're not nodding enough. I'm going to keep going. We moved into this building, and there was parking issues, all right? Like more than there are now. And we asked people, some of our volunteers, we said, hey, could you park over at the hospital? And I got an email that said, hey, wait a second. We've been with you for a long time. We've been setting up and tearing down the church, working real hard, getting here early, staying late, setting up and tearing down. We're the ones that paid for this building. Now, we got to go park over there with all these new people coming in. I said, no, you don't have to. You can go find another church. All right? Because this is going to be a place that we're always going to keep the main thing. And the main thing, if you're wondering, is love God and love people. That's it. Everything else is negotiable. Everything else is negotiable. We can change the music. We can change the look of the place. You can change whatever you want. But you never change that if I'm around. Love God and love people. That's the main thing, and I'm done. All right, let's keep going. All right, verse 20. Verse 17. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened, the man replied. He is a prophet. Then they wanted this guy to rat Jesus out and say like, well, I wasn't really blind. He paid me to say this, that kind of stuff. But he didn't do it. And so then they went to the guy's parents and they said, we know he is your son. Verse 20, the parents answered, we know that he was born blind, but how can he see now, or who opened his eyes? We don't know. Ask him, he's of age. He'll speak for himself. In other words, they back up his story. So then they go back to the guy a second time and interrogate him in verse 24. They are on a witch hunt for Jesus. A second time they summon the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. Now, when we're around a teaching team, and the way this works around here is we have a group of people that teach. We rotate, but we all teach the same thing. Wherever campus you go to, we're teaching the same thing. So we are discussing this, and somebody says, oh, these guys are the skeptics. I said, no, they're not the skeptics. I love the skeptics. These guys are not skeptics. These guys have closed minds. These guys have already made up their mind. They say, listen, we know Jesus is a sinner. A skeptic is a person that comes in with questions. Hey, I'm not quite sure about this Jesus walking on water thing. I'm not quite sure. You get so excited about the Bible. I'm not so sure that this book is really reliable and that it can apply to our lives. Jesus comes along and says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. That sounds very exclusive to me, and that does not work in our culture, and people have these questions, and I'm telling you, I love the questions. When people are honestly seeking God, man, questions we can work with. If you're here today and you're a skeptic, I mean, let's talk. Because you're asking the same questions, I guarantee, that people, hundreds of thousands of millions of people, have asked for the last 2,000 years. And there are answers to your questions. There are answers to the questions. It's not like you're going to come up with a question that like stumps God. Where he's like, you ask the question and God goes, oh man, I never thought of that one. That's a good one, man. You're right. Right? Like God can handle it. He's big enough for your honest questions. And nobody around here wants you to check your brain at the door and just go, oh, well, we're just going to blindly have faith. No, keep asking your questions. So if you're a skeptic, you are welcome here. We love you. All right? But then what happens is, it says he replied. The man replied. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see. So that's my story. And God's going to use this guy's story to begin to impact people's lives. And don't you love it? I just talked to the skeptics. Can I talk to the Christians in the room? Don't you love it that God can use your story? That you don't have to be an expert in theology. You don't have to have a PhD in Christian apologetics to love your neighbor, to reach your neighbor, to serve your neighbor. You just share your story. What is the difference that Jesus has made in your life? Like this guy said, I was blind, but now I see. What's your story? Like my marriage was on the rocks. Jesus saved it. We were in debt up to our eyeballs and didn't know what to do until we started following God's principles for finances. And God's bringing financial peace to our world. What's your story? I was an addict. I drank a little too much. But God has helped me put that in the right place in my life. Just share your story. I used to have no purpose. I was super successful in business. And yet I woke up every day like, why am I working so hard? What am I really trying to do? And God has now given me purpose that makes me want to get up every day and enjoy what I'm doing. You understand? Like you have a story. You just got to figure out what your story is and share that with other people. Well, for time's sake, I got to tell you the rest of this story and be done. It says, then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I told you already, I don't know. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? I love this guy now. Now I'm loving this guy. All right, verse 35. We don't have it up here. Let me just read it to you. Verse 28. Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. So they argue back and forth until finally they throw him out. Fine, we're done with you. Then in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, well, you've now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him.